Hey everyone, Allie Tomlinson here from Community of Champions. I just wanted to drop in and make sure that you had full access to our last Food for Thought Friday because it was so good. Now that I've said good, I want to say I think it was great. We had Guy Stevens, the founder and executive director from the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint, with us, and he was talking about all of the outdated crisis management techniques used in schools across the nation. And he also talked to us about the prolonged effects it has on students and staff alike. Now, let me tell you a little bit about Guy. He's from Maryland and he has completed extensive training trying to be the best advocate that he can be. He's completed trainings like the Parents Place of Maryland Leaders Training and the Maryland Coalition of Families Family Leadership Institute. And that's 60 hours of extensive training for parents and caregivers. Now, he is currently a member of the board of directors for the Art of Maryland and the Council of the Parents, Attorney, and Advocates. But above all else, he's a parent. He's a father and a husband. And I know a lot of us can relate to that, just being a parent and a partner. Parenthood is where his advocacy journey began. Advocacy starts with seeing a need and deciding to take action. And that's why we were so lucky to have Guy with us, not just to share the important information with us, but to share how truly championing for change really makes a difference. You see the need and you decide to change it through advocacy. Now, this was one of our longer Food for Thought Fridays because all the information was so important. So when we recap this, I want to skip our intro. I know that we are Community of Champions. You know that we are powered by Friendship Community Care and we're funded through the Governor's Council on Developmental Disabilities. And if you don't know our mission and vision, you know where to find it. I want to start in on Guy's why. I want you to understand his vision first. I want you to understand how he got there. So let's jump in right when Guy's telling us exactly why he started this advocacy journey.
And unfortunately, the first time it didn't was in the end of the fifth grade year, where he had been doing really, really well. In fact, so well that he had moved from a self-contained classroom to the general education setting for all but one of his classes. So he was really on a good pathway. Unfortunately, in the fifth grade, he had a couple of instances where he began to have some difficulty. And that was precipitated after a teacher he'd been working with for about 2.5 years had a car accident. And unfortunately, due to the accident, she wasn't able to return. And this was a really important relationship for him. And when that happened, we began to see some behaviors that we hadn't seen for years. He would get overwhelmed. He would, elope, kind of run out of the classroom. And unfortunately, a couple of those situations ended in a very similar way, where he ran off, hid in a bathroom, clearly overwhelmed. Unfortunately, he was eventually coaxed out of the bathroom, only to be physically restrained, drugged down a hallway, and thrown into an empty classroom. This happened twice, and it was really, really traumatic on him. In fact, so traumatic that at the end of that year, we had to really evaluate options in terms of what we could do. We actually ended up deciding to homeschool him for the next 2 years because he didn't want to go back to school. These interventions really have a lot of impact on kids. And of course, the first time this happened, I'd never even heard the terms restraint seclusion in the context of a school. I would have never imagined these were things that happened in schools. Unfortunately, I found out a lot more since then. And our story of kind of the formation of the alliance began because, this was the first incidents that, I really was becoming aware of it. We homeschooled him for 2 years, and after that, he decided he wanted to go back to school. So, we worked really hard with our district to try to get him an appropriate placement, to talk about what had happened previously. And we worked hard through the summer, going into that school year, to make sure they would have a program that would be appropriate for him, and expressed our concerns about what had happened previously. And unfortunately, despite our best efforts, he went back to the eighth grade in 2018. He was going to again be in a special standalone classroom setting in a larger public school. And he got into that program. He was there for 15 days. And over those 15 days, he was restrained and or secluded at least 4 times. We actually think it happened more. And that was really, again, traumatic. By the end of those 15 days, a particularly traumatic event occurred, and he was not going to go back to school. And, frankly, as an eighth grader, you can't just make a kid go back to school that doesn't want to go back to school. He was afraid. And we immediately worked to get him some help in the short term. We got him some counseling. We got him through agreement with the IP team. We agreed to home and hospital, which might be called something different in your state, but sometimes homebound, home and hospital. But that's essentially where a teacher came out to our house a couple days a week to work with my son. That continued throughout the rest of that school year. Fortunately for us, it was a really good experience. The home and hospital teacher that was selected was one that we had worked with, well, excuse me, one that had been in education for about 50 years. And he was about early 70s, been doing it for a long time. And he was and is a wonderful person. The first thing he did is he came into our house and built a relationship with my son and got to know him. And over the remainder of the year, he worked with him fantastically. Never did he need to restrain, seclude, or use any kind of intervention like that. And to this day, we have a relationship. In fact, we're going to his house on Saturday to visit him. So, really important relationship. But all of that got to this point where as a parent, we had had a negative experience with our son. We had no idea the scope of this problem beyond that. We were just kind of one parent in a situation that was unfamiliar to us. And, I remember talking to my son about what had happened and telling him that this is not okay. This should not have happened to him. And, ultimately that led to a promise. And my promise to him was that I was going to do anything within my power to make sure this didn't happen to him again or others like him. And that was kind of the seed that grew into what is now the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint. I began after that doing a significant amount of research. And the more research I did, the more I became aware of the problems, not just in our local district, but in the state and across the nation and even beyond. I was looking at scientific primary literature. I was looking at anything I could find, news articles, government reports, all of this information. And I began to uncover that there was a much bigger problem than I ever imagined. And of course, as you look at the data, you find that restraint and seclusion happen disproportionately to kids with disabilities, as well as Black and brown children. And not just disproportionately. I mean, the latest report came out from the Government Accountability Office. 80% of the restraints, 77% of seclusions in public schools across the country happen to children with disabilities. So that was really the start of the Alliance, was this idea that I had begun doing a lot of research and I realized there was a problem, and began working locally initially in our school district. And I'm going to leave out a lot of details, but we're able to work with our Board of Education, lead towards a change in policy to eliminate the use of seclusion, reduce the use of restraint. We brought in alternative approaches as well, which we'll certainly want to talk about later. But we brought a lot of things in to inform a positive change. But the work's so much bigger. It's local, it's state, it's federal. And as the Alliance, we've been working on all of those levels. We're a kind of a volunteer led and managed organization. When all this happened, I had a full-time job at the university. I still do, but now my running, joke is that I have two full-time jobs, because running an organization is a big job as well. So that was the start, and I can certainly answer more questions about it, but the start of how I got involved in this advocacy was because of what happened to my son. And then as I realized that this was happening, really across the world, we can do better. There are so many better things we can be doing other than restraining and secluding children.
Definitely a personal story to your advocacy journey,
Absolutely.
then. Definitely. And I want to make it clear that here at Community of Champions, we do not tell people what to advocate for. Our job is to put forth resources and to make sure everyone has the tools to be able to advocate. So what we're doing today here, what we're doing, is just making sure everyone has all the information they need to make their own mind up on this specific topic. And then if they want to start advocating for this change, they know how to do it. That's our job. We create advocates, and then we give them the information that they need to make up their own mind about it. And that's kind of the lack of resources, the lack of knowing where to start. And so we definitely stand on the foundation of staying vital. Vote, include, talk, accept, and use respectful language. But we also know that, like I said before, you have to have strong resources to be strong advocate. And so that's part of our job too. And so people have wanted to hear from you, Guy, here in Arkansas.
Hmm.
They've requested it. And so we're so thankful that you're here today. But I want to ask you, I want to kind of circle back on something that you said. 80% of people with disabilities inside school districts were being secluded and restrained. Do you have the percentage of students that make up public school districts who actually have disabilities?
So just to be clear,
Uh-huh.
um, it's not 80% of the children with disabilities are restrained. It's out of all of the restraints, 80% of those are children with disabilities. So just to be
Okay.
clear,
Yes,
because
yes.
that paints a much different picture.
Okay.
But I mean, you can see the disproportionality.
Yes.
And I'm trying to remember the latest data, and I may get it wrong, but it's about 12 to 14% of the population in our public schools are children with disabilities.
That was
So
the number that I came across, but I
that's right.
wanted to make sure with you because I'm sure that you had maybe some different data that I had,
Right.
especially since this is what you're doing every day.
Right.
So, and I definitely saw a big gap.
Oh, it's
Um,
a huge gap. Yeah.
yes,
Yeah. I mean,
definitely.
when you have 12% of the population making up 80% of these interventions, that alone should be cause for alarm. I mean, why? Why is this happening, and what should we be doing differently? Should be questions that we're thinking about.
So tell me this, Guy, because some of us have never had an experience in this, and I know just because we haven't had an experience in this doesn't mean that we can't make up our mind to see that there needs to be change. What exactly does seclusion look like? What exactly does restraint look like?
Sure, sure. So there's definitions, and then there's giving clarity to it. But restraint. I mean, to start out in a way that may be a little frightening. I mean, a restraint is what happened in the case of George Floyd, where he was died being restrained by police. A restraint is a physical intervention where you're essentially taking control of someone else's body. Restraints can look different ways. There are seated restraints where maybe two adults will come alongside a child and kind of lock arms and try to sit them down. There are different types of restraint, like prone restraint, which we've heard a lot about. Prone restraint is one that's a face down restraint. Unfortunately, prone restraint has led to a number of deaths. And it's important to realize, we hear about in the news, deaths due to restraint in law enforcement, but there have been numerous deaths over the past couple of decades of kids in schools. I mean, Cornelius Frederick, about a month before the death of George Floyd, a young man named Cornelius Frederick, 16 years old, in a school in Michigan, a residential school in Michigan, he was restrained by, I think, 5 or 6 adults after he threw a sandwich. And he was restrained, I want to say, for 12 minutes until he began to lose consciousness. He died subsequently in the hospital. Max Benson, about a year prior to that, had died being restrained at a school in California. So restraint can really be dangerous. And when you look at that data, so we talked about the number of kids, disproportionately, that are in special education programs. But if you look at the data even more, you find that very often the kids this is happening to the most are the youngest kids. They're 6, 7, 8 years old. They're very young children. It's not happening as commonly in middle school or high school, but on the youngest kids. And the younger kids, I mean, I hate to say this, but they're easier to physically control. And as a child gets bigger, you might think twice about physically restraining. But the point is, restraint can look differently. There's supine, there's prone, there's kind of back down, face down, all of those different kinds of restraints. Now, one of the issues here, and I'm sure we'll dive into this, but currently there's no federal law in place to protect kids in school against the use of restraint and seclusion. There are federal laws that govern these things in different settings, like law enforcement and in medical settings, but not in our schools. It's been an issue they've looked at for well over a decade. In 2009, there was a report from the Government Accountability Office bringing up cases of death and abuse and injury. So this has long been on the radar of lawmakers, and we can talk later about it being on the radar again. But without federal law, every state has their own set of laws that govern this. Some of them are better than others, but regardless of what the law says, very often these interventions are used inappropriately when they're not intended. If you look at federal guidance, and again, there's no federal law, but the federal government did offer guidance in 2012, and they provided what was called the 15 Principles document. That document kind of laid out the usage of restraint and seclusion. And in doing so, it basically said you should not be using these interventions unless the situation involves imminent serious physical harm. meaning that a child has gotten so dysregulated, there's a chance that they would have a life-threatening injury either to themselves or someone else. So it's a really high bar. It's not just they were unsafe. It's not they threw an eraser. It's not that they were disrespectful. It's not that they used bad language. It's that there's a chance of life or death. And unfortunately, even in states that have better laws, we find that it's often used in cases it shouldn't be. So the definition of restraint is it's a physical hold of some kind, and there's training companies that teach that. Seclusion gets confused often. Seclusion is essentially putting a student alone in a room or area against their will and preventing them from leaving. So this is not a timeout where you're sitting with a student. They're in a different place, but they're sitting with someone else. This is not where a student says, you know, hey, I need a break. I need to go to a quiet space, where it's self-directed. This is against their will, alone, and refuse the ability to leave. So, you know, for instance, sensory rooms, no problem with sensory rooms. If a child needs a proper space to help them to regulate, great. But this is, you're being carried into a room, forcibly pushed into the room, and prevented from leaving. And kids have been injured through this process as well. I know a young man from Virginia that when he was much younger got thrown into a seclusion room, and shutting the door, it broke part of his hand and part of his foot. In Georgia, I don't remember the year, but a young man hung himself in a seclusion room. You know, very bad things happen. And the truth is, and, you know, being forced in a room by yourself, we are social beings, and we rely on others when we're becoming dysregulated to help us regulate. So putting a child who doesn't have a fully developed brain into a room by themselves and thinking it's going to calm them down, it's anything but. I mean, anyone who's ever told someone to calm down has quickly learned the lesson that telling somebody to calm down is not going to help them calm down. And I've been reminded of that once or twice in my life. But certainly think about being forcefully put into a room. These things are really, really traumatic. So that's what they look like. And again, the intent is that these are such serious interventions that they should only ever be used in an emergency situation that involves life or death. But coming from a state like Maryland, I'm outside of the District of Columbia. Coming from a state like Maryland, we've got some of the stronger laws in the nation. We have the clause that says imminent serious physical harm. And what I can tell you is that it very often happens for reasons that don't rise to that. Probably the majority of instances. My son was secluded once for throwing or splashing water. You know, I don't know where that rises to a life or death situation. So very often there's a misunderstanding of what that is, and these things are overused in environments. And the point is that they're traumatizing. When you force somebody in a room against their will, or you have several adults holding a child down, that is traumatizing. Imagine yourself, even as an adult, having that happen. You became dysregulated and people lined up and held you down. It's extremely traumatic. And the problem is trauma. A lot of our kids have trauma histories to start with. So a lot of kids come from an environment where maybe they've had some childhood trauma. If a child has a disability, they may have some trauma that's inherent to that as well. If you have communication difficulties or differences, it may be traumatic trying to communicate with people. So we often have trauma. And the thing about trauma is that it can put us into what we would refer to as a hypervigilant state. Because we've been traumatized, our fear detection systems are on high. We're always scanning our environment for danger. And it makes it more likely in that hypervigilant state that you may have distressed behaviors. And if you have distressed behaviors, and the response to those behaviors are demands for compliance and not someone actually helping you to re-regulate, this is where kids begin to enter into fight or flight mode. And that happens, and then they're restrained and secluded. So you can see it makes a cycle because you re-traumatize them, you're making it more likely. So if restraint and seclusion worked as interventions, you do it once and never have to do it again. But it's not an intervention that's helpful. It's a emergency type of intervention that should only be very rare. And in my opinion, seclusion should go away completely. You can even look at things from the United Nations about torture, and, think about solitary confinement. I mean, this is essentially what we're talking about. And we're talking about very young, undeveloped brains. We should not be throwing children into rooms by themselves. I don't think that should ever happen. And frankly, if restraint were really used in an emergency situation, only when there was a life or death situation, it would be exceedingly unusual. It would be exceedingly rare because we don't have a lot of life or death emergencies happening, in a typical school every day. And what you find though is in some schools, these things are happening frequently and they're being used to control behavior, not to help people to have the skills to better manage their behavior.
You said a couple of phrases here that meant a lot, and I really put in a lot of research. And you've been a great mentor to me during this research time. And it was that bodily harm and different things like that, that imminent and immediate danger, and non-compliance. Those things, they don't mean the same thing, do they?
They don't mean the same thing. No, they don't. I mean, imminent serious physical harm has a legal definition. In fact, it's defined as the same thing as serious bodily injury. They have a legal definition that is outlined in law. It's actually even outlined in IDEA, and it means, and I'm going to paraphrase it being a life or death injury, but it is a potentially life or death injury. It is serious bodily disfigurement. It is affecting an organ or brain in a serious capacity. It is a really high standard, and we should not ever be using interventions like restraint or seclusion, which can result in serious injury and death in situations that don't meet that really high standard. They should be crisis interventions. And again, I think seclusion should go away completely, and I think restraint should be exceedingly rare. But very often, what we find is in a typical setting that, unfortunately, and I'm not at all anti-educator. I think there are amazing people out there in our classrooms that are doing, an amazing job working with children. Unfortunately, sometimes the culture is such that in a given school system, they've learned that this is the tool that they have at their disposal. When children do this, this is what we do. And that's kind of propagated. So that's just the culture of working with kids. There are far better things that we can be doing, and we can talk more about those later, but there are far better approaches to working with kids that may have, kind of distress oriented behaviors or behaviors that might be challenging to the staff. There are far better things that we can do. But what we find is it's not happening more times than not. It's not happening for that life or death situation. It's happening for noncompliance. It's happening for disrespect. It's happening for bad language. It's happening for minor behaviors. And this isn't just my opinion. If you want to look at some recent news, the Chicago Tribune and ProPublica did a huge story in Illinois about a year ago, and that uncovered through these reports the many instances where kids were being restrained and secluded for things that were far below any kind of life or death, any kind of life or death standard. So absolutely, they're not the same thing. The intent again is that these are emergency interventions and should be very, very rare. But the practice is that it often happens much more commonly. And the word safety, my son, the word safety now is actually a trigger for him because safety was used as the premise for restraining and secluding him. And there's a difference even here between the word safety and imminent serious physical harm. Something can be unsafe, but not be life or death. So there's a big difference. And what we find is very commonly, whether it's at a school level or at a district level or at a state level, it would be amazing to you how people begin to dispute definitions. And at one point in my efforts locally, I had people tell me, well, imminent serious physical harm means something different for me as it means for you. And of course I shook my head and said, no, it means a life or death injury. It's not subjective. However, it's often, viewed that way, like, oh, well, it was unsafe. Unsafe's not the bar here. It's life or death. So at any rate, no, they absolutely don't mean the same thing, but we often find that people are sometimes, and, I'm not blaming, I think that sometimes it's the guidance that people get. There's a big industry on training people in crisis management. And I'll tell you, I've talked to people at some of these companies and I've seen some of their training manuals. And, I have some positive things to say about some and others. I've looked at training manuals that say things like, imagine yourself being a teacher and receiving this training. They'll say things like, imagine a child might become violent at any moment. If that's your guiding principle in a classroom, you yourself as an educator are going to be in a fight or flight mode. You're going to be hyper vigilant. And if you're in that state, you're going to be more likely to be reactive, because a reactive adult is not going to help a child that's struggling to that's struggling to regulate.
Right. There's no way to regulate to each other.
That's right.
Um,
That's right. And you know, all of this, you know, there's some really, really smart people doing a lot of amazing work. And, you know, I'm lucky enough to be able to read and learn. And sometimes I throw these things around like, you know, I just had this thought and it's not my thought. But, you know, people like Bruce Perry that talk about, or Mona de la Hook, you know, they talk about how even the things that we're doing, you know, our behaviors can be contagious. You know, if we're stressed, if we're reactive, you know, this is, and we, you know, anybody that's a parent has seen this before. You know, and that's why, you know, it's so important to use approaches where, you know, and I learned this very early. I learned this very early with my son. It's like, you know, he had meltdowns, you know, when he was much younger. We don't see much of that now, but I learned very early that I need to be very calm. Everything's okay. You know, I needed to help him to regulate, not myself spike up. And unfortunately, despite people's best intent, it is often a teacher or an educator in a classroom that is not only failing to de-escalate, but rather unintentionally escalating the situation. And there's a lot of brain science here. And you'll hear me talk about the importance of different approaches. And one of them is kind of being informed by neuroscience. Trauma-informed approaches kind of take our brain into account. But if you begin to understand even some very simple you know, concepts involving our brain, you'll understand that if we get into a fight or flight mode, our brains are now working from a section of our brain called the amygdala. And when that amygdala is alert, that is our survival brain. It is about fight or flight. When that amygdala is lit up because you have become dysregulated, what happens is you're no longer really communicating with your frontal cortex. Your frontal cortex is executive function, it's decision making, it's rationalization. But when your amygdala is lit up and you're feeling distressed, you're not working there. So if our response to a child who's in a high level of distress is to place additional demands on them, you need to do this, you need to do that, they're not hearing that. They're actually not able to process the things that you're putting on them. So, you know, being aware of the impact of trauma, being aware of the way our brain works, and it doesn't mean you have to be a neurologist, you know, you just have to have enough to know the impact that these things have. And there's some great people doing work out there. Dr. Lori Desautel is one who actually teaches a neuroscience informed education certificate, and was a special educator, and now actually is a professor at, I believe, Butler University, but also works in the classroom with teachers, and, you know, focuses on kind of the neuroscience piece and even helping kids and staff to understand their own brain and brain state. So there's so much we can be doing. And anyway, that was a long answer to your question. I'm sorry.
no, that was so much. You're just a wealth of knowledge, and we appreciate everything that you're giving us. What I am picking up from you is that it is crucial, just to circle back, it's crucial to have all of these things clearly defined, though, by maybe state and also each school district. That way we have them laid out. And it would be great if I mean, they all meant the same thing. That way everyone could have a clear cut guideline. And also that the bar should be set very, very, very high on, you know, what this bodily harm is and when
Mhm.
to be able to use restraints, and it needs to be set high for a reason, because we don't need to be just doing this all willy-nilly. I mean,
Right.
we're in Arkansas, we don't need to be throwing this around because of what it can cause
Right.
our students and our children. And
Mhm.
also, to be honest, there's probably a lot of teachers, a lot of paraprofessionals that that they probably don't want to get involved in that
Right.
type of behavior, but they're not being trained to do anything else.
That's right. Well, you know what's ironic to me, and you know, I'm seeing some really positive things around this issue right now, and I'm seeing some new awareness from a lot of different people. But what was initially surprising to me was the find that, you know, in education, teachers often felt they needed these interventions to keep themselves safe. And even school unions, teacher unions would argue that, you know, we can't take away teachers' ability to do these things because it wouldn't be safe. The irony there is that anytime you restrain or seclude a child, you are increasing the chance that either the child or yourself will sustain an injury. Because when you are restraining, and you can think about this right now. If I were to come up behind you and begin to restrain you, your body would go into a panic mode. You would go into a fight or flight mode. And that's what happens with children, is they enter that fight or flight state. And the adult will often escalate as well. So when you have individuals in a fight or flight mode, the chance of injury is astronomical, because people are fighting back. They want to get free. Teachers get punched and kicked and hit trying to restrain kids. So, the truth is we should be avoiding these things at all costs, because they do increase the chance of injury. I'll tell you a little story about an organization in Virginia. There's a crisis prevention alternative called UCARU, and it was developed by a group in Virginia called Grafton Integrated Health. Grafton Integrated Health ran a number of special education day schools and residential facilities. 2 decades ago, like everyone else, they used restraint and seclusion. They used it a lot. They had a lot of injuries to staff, a lot of injuries to students. So many injuries that at one point they were going to lose their workman's compensation insurance. And ultimately, they had to do some soul searching, and they had a new CEO that came in. I think his name was Jim Gaynor, if I'm not mistaken. And he came in and said, we've got to change. We've got to do something differently. And they began to think about alternative approaches to restraint and seclusion. They ultimately developed a program called UCARU, and UCARU is a trauma-informed alternative to crisis management. We can talk about it more later if you'd like, but the message here that I wanted to share is, after they implemented UCARU over a 10-year period, not only did they see fewer injuries to teachers and staff and students, they also saw increased teacher satisfaction. They also happen to save millions of dollars. So in doing the right thing, they actually were doing something better for the entire organization. So there's this myth that we need these things to stay safe, and the data actually shows the opposite. And I'd also point out that one of the things that we sometimes hear, because there are a lot of myths here, people will sometimes say things like, well, we're trained. We know how to do safe restraint. So my answer to that is, there is no such thing as safe restraint. Anytime you restrain anyone, if they're not a willing participant, I mean, the only safe restraint would be a make-believe one, because if they're not a willing participant, they may have a reaction. That reaction may be a fight or flight reaction, and you don't know where they're going to swing their leg, their fist, or what they're going to do. There is no such thing as a safe restraint. There certainly are things that lower the risk. But, I was told, oh, well, gee, we have training. We know how to do it safely. Unfortunately, as parents, and I'm sure that, that you and others in your community will relate to this, but as parents, we often, we're given the information by a team of professionals, and we often believe it, because here's this team of professionals telling us that this is safe, or that we're doing this because we have to, and we accept that. What I would tell you is, I always think it's a good idea to be critical, meaning that you're really kind of thinking about things, and if they don't make sense to you, it's the same effect that we get when people go to the doctor's office. It comes from the doctor, so it must be true. And I've always been one, even at a doctor's office, I'll advocate for myself and ask questions and want to know why. But it's important to do that with your child's education as well. If something doesn't make sense to you, ask a lot of questions, look for independent information, do some research on your own, because, again, parents will sometimes be, fooled into believing, and it's not necessarily misintention by the staff. It could be miseducation. It could be they're not aware of these other things that we could be doing, and this is what they believe is the right thing to do. To me, it's kind of hard to process, because, when you see restraint or seclusion in action, and you see it happen to an 8-year-old, it's hard to imagine what happens in your brain to think that that's okay. But, I think sometimes we normalize these things, and when you do, you don't stop and think about it. But I've had conversations with educators and with others that have worked in schools that did a lot of these interventions, that had their own moment, like, no, this isn't right. We shouldn't be doing this. This isn't helping. Unfortunately, whether you're a parent or even an educator, school systems sometimes can be protective. So if they're doing something you don't agree with, parents and educators both have been retaliated against for raising awareness and concern. So, those can be real concerns as well.
I'm so glad that you touched on that. We had some questions come in about the teachers that felt like they were trained. How
Mhm,
do we address that? How do we feel about that? So I'm really glad that you touched on that. Thank you so much.
mhm.
Now I want to bring up Mr. Alex Campbell. I had the privilege of hearing him speak, and he's the director with the director, campaign director. Is that right?
Yeah, the Keeping All Students Safe Act is a federal act to, to add federal legislation regarding restraint and seclusion. It would prohibit the use of seclusion completely, limit the use of restraint, and adds a lot of measures. It's been floating around for several years. CASA was first introduced, I want to say 2003, but my year maybe, or 13, my 2013. My year may be wrong. I'm trying to remember the exact date. But it's been introduced and reintroduced. And in fact, yesterday it was reintroduced again. So there is an effort right now to push federal legislation regarding restraint and seclusion. Alex is a 15-year-old self-advocate, autistic self-advocate. He's on our
Powerful
team. Yeah,
self-advocate. He's wonderful.
absolutely. Alex is amazing. He and I connected. I had read his story in a newspaper and sent him an email, and he sent me back a nice email, and we kind of stayed in touch. And then I'd reach out to him to ask him to join the team, and he's joined the team. And he and I presented recently at a conference, and we're presenting again at the TASH conference later in December. But he's got a personal story of being restrained and secluded himself. My son is also 15, and he and I have talked about whether or not he wanted to share his story, and it's his story. So I respect his opinion on when he's ready to do that. He's always been very supportive of the efforts that I've been making. But Alex, from a very young age, 8 years old, I think, began to campaign for change in Virginia. There are photos of him standing on piles of books at the Senate, providing testimony. And the thing is, so here it is for you and the parents that there are a lot of people and organizations in place trying to affect change. It could be your disability law center, it could be an organization like your own. There are a lot of places trying to advocate for change. If a lawyer or advocate go and talk to a legislative body, they're going to have impact. But you know what? A parent coming to that same body is going to have even more impact. And if we want to go up the impact scale, someone like Alex providing testimony. So, if you have a child that would be interested in doing that kind of thing, it's even more powerful because when you hear a firsthand story of what it felt like to be restrained, and Alex is such a amazing human. I mean, he's got, I call him jokingly Senator Campbell because he's interested in politics, and I can see at some point him ending up in a elected position.
Well, I want to say that he said something that really has stuck with me ever since I heard it. And he was talking about how children are not light switches. They
Mhm.
do not have behaviors that just come on and
Right.
off. And that if there is a behavior that is starting that is deemed inappropriate, dangerous, that there was probably circumstances or behaviors before that leading up to it that could have been identified. And so,
Absolutely.
um, my question is more training needed for our teachers that could prevent the need? And I know that you touched on this earlier, but I really want to dig into that. I really
Mhm.
do. Could training prevent seclusion and restraint altogether, or for most part? Is that lack of training leading to this? Is it a domino effect? You know, do we see that these teachers that are not having this training on communication and the communication between behaviors and what behaviors are telling you, without that training, are they not able to support students and give them the accommodation they need, and is that then leading them into having these traumatic experiences?
So the very simple answer is yes, but as you could probably guess, there's a much longer answer. And absolutely, so one of the things I've been saying a lot lately. So we endorse the Keeping All Students Safe Act, which was just reintroduced, and we support that idea of federal legislation. I think it's important, especially given. I mean, this is really a civil rights issue, in my opinion, looking at how it disproportionately impacts kids with disabilities. But if we had federal legislation tomorrow, it would not solve the problem in its totality. In fact, it could even lead to a kind of a case of unintended consequences, because sometimes what will happen, and we saw this happen in Illinois, after the stories broke, the governor said we're gonna ban seclusion and prone restraint temporarily until we can pass legislation. And when they did, there were schools that were serving populations of kids that were being restrained and secluded frequently, who then talked to their parents and said, well, gee, they're not going to allow us to use these important tools that we need to be able to work with your child. And if we can't do that, we either need to send your child home or call the police. So it's not just a matter of passing a law, but we absolutely have to get into place the right approaches. And, I know that you're familiar with the work that we do at the Alliance, and that's where a big part of our focus is. We want to bring together anybody that's interested in this issue, whether it be, a parent whose child has been restrained or secluded, a self-advocate who themselves has been restrained or secluded, a teacher has been working in a classroom where they use restraint or seclusion, or is very against it, or a administrator or an attorney, or whoever it may be. We want to bring people together, and ultimately we want to provide tools and education to help lead people down a road where we can reduce and eliminate these things. So, for example, one of the phrase I've been using a lot lately is, I believe that we need trauma-informed, neuroscience-based, relationship-driven, collaborative approaches to working with children. Now, that's a lot to unpack, because I said a lot of what sound like buzzwords, but let me unpack those a little bit. So what do I mean by trauma-informed? It's a big word in education right now, but trauma-informed doesn't mean you sat through an 8-hour training. It means you actually have an understanding of what trauma is, how it affects children. There was a very well-known study called the ACEs study, which was the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, and it looked at the impact of adverse childhood experiences on a child's life, even down the road into adulthood, and the effects that it could have. We understand more about trauma today than we've ever known. The 90s was the decade of the brain. We learned a lot about the way the brain works, a lot about the impact of trauma. So trauma-informed means understanding that trauma happens, understanding the impact that trauma has, and then understanding how to work with people that have been through traumatic experiences. So trauma-informed training is really important in our schools. Recently, we interviewed a gentleman named Matthew Portell. Matthew runs a school, Fall Hamilton Elementary, I believe it is, outside of Nashville, and it is a trauma-informed school. He started in 2015 with a goal of really kind of turning it into a trauma-informed school. And there are practices in place to make the school trauma-informed for the students, the teachers, and the staff. There are things that help all that are there to better be able to understand and manage trauma of the students they had. And they were able to, I think, eliminate suspension and expulsions. They just don't do that. They were able to reduce restraints, and I don't believe they're using seclusion anymore. So they were able to have some really positive effects by being trauma informed. What's that look like in practice? There's a lot of different things it looks like in practice. At the time they were talking about, they had like these peace corners that were like places in the classroom where a kid could go, and there were things to do if they needed some time. Teachers had the ability to tap out. Like if a teacher was feeling overwhelmed and their amygdala was warming up, they could tap out to another teacher who could come in and take over for a little while. They had, very relationship, and relationship is one of the things that I mentioned also, but I'll get to that in a second, but a lot of relationship built into all of this as well. So trauma-informed is item one, and related to that is this neuroscience piece. And again, I'm not suggesting that all teachers need to be a neurologist, but if you understand some of the very basic science of the brain and how the brain works, you begin to understand how trauma actually affects the brain. Just understanding the changes that happen to us physiologically when we enter into a fight or flight mode is extremely useful. Understanding that there's changes that happen in our ear canals, there's changes that happen in our brain, and we change our approach based on science. We help kids and teachers both to understand what brain state means. So those neuroscience-based approaches, I think, are really helpful. The other thing I mentioned was relationship driven, and I'm a huge proponent. In fact, I often joke, and I may not be alone in this, but my 3 R's of education are not the usual 3 R's. They are relationship, relationship, relationship. Relationships are so critical, and especially to children that may have had trauma histories or children with disabilities. Relationships are really, really critical. My son was very successful for a number of years when he had an amazing teacher and an amazing relationship. But not everybody approaches things the same way, and that's true whether we're talking about teachers or any other profession. There are some in education that are very compliance based. We live in a society today that is, partly very law and order focused, and partly very compliance based. So whether you're talking about our law enforcement or our education, there's often a very high priority placed on, you will do what I said because I said, and I'm the person here in power. Relationships bring a different component. It's about understanding and relating to kids. And who do we do the best work for? We do the best work for people that we like. You can think about your own life and the educators you've had or the bosses you've had. We do our best when we're working with people that support us. So relationships are critical, and collaborative approaches. Working with kids, we often spend a lot of time doing things to kids, okay, because they're miniature adults that we think we just control. And it's amazing what happens when you actually begin to invite kids into the process. So I'm a big fan, for instance, of the work of Dr. Ross Green. Ross Green is the developer of the collaborative and proactive solutions approach. And his approach is it's simple and powerful. He begins with his guiding philosophy. And the guiding philosophy is kids do well if they can. And that probably doesn't shake anybody's earth when I say that. They probably don't like, well, okay, that makes sense. But if you look at that against our expectation in education, very often the expectation in education is that kids do well if they want to. And if you believe that kids do well if they want to, it's a matter of motivation. And when they're not doing well, you want to offer them either incentives or punishment or consequence. If you believe that kids do well if they can, it's a different conversation, because if they're not doing well, you begin to ask questions. Why are they having a difficult time? Do they have some kind of unsolved problem? Are they lacking a skill? In education, we teach skills. So if somebody has a reading deficit, we teach them how to read. Well, if you're lagging the social skills you need to adapt responsively to situations, we need to teach those skills as well. So he's got an entire process that he works through, but there's a great book called Lost at School that he wrote. And in Lost in School, it carries this collaborative proactive solutions model into a school environment and shows you what it looks like. But it looks like problem solving with a kid. You begin by understanding why things are difficult for them. And rather than, because as adults, we love to come up with solutions. And we will unilaterally say, okay, well, here's the solution. Sometimes we give choices. We think we're doing better, and we're like, you can do this or you can do this. But amazing things can happen when you can actually invite a child into that process and work out a solution together. And you know what? Kids are more vested into working on solutions that they've helped to develop. So anyway, there's a lot of different models, but again, those key tenets: trauma-informed, neuroscience-based, neuroscience-driven, based, relationship-driven, collaborative. Those are all the important elements. And these are trainable things. Again, lots of amazing work. I begin, sometimes if there's an issue, maybe it's bringing a copy of Lost in School to your IEP team. Mona Delahook has a fantastic book called Beyond Behaviors. You hit on this a little earlier, and I'll just hit on it briefly, but in a school setting, we are very grounded in kind of what I would call the classical behaviorism approaches. So if a child's having a hard time, they begin by doing a functional behavior assessment, and then they tell you the behaviors your child is having, and then they attribute those to certain functions of behavior. They say, well, it was avoidance, it was attention seeking, it was object seeking, it was these very simple functions. Any of you that have ever been in that situation and you're thinking, that's not my kid, he's not seeking attention here, there's more to the situation, but very often through a behaviorist lens, they're looking at things through these very simplified functions. And the truth is, there are more reasons than that for a child's behavior. If, for instance, a child enters a fight or flight mode, that's a non-volitional behavior. They're not making a choice. And very often, we're looking at 8-year-olds, 9-year-olds, and talking about their choices. Well, your child's being manipulative. Your child is whatever it may be. And our assumptions are sometimes very wrong. Mona Delahook's work, Beyond Behaviors, fantastic book, but it goes into understanding these things that are coming from the bottom up. There's kind of this idea of top down or bottom up behaviors, and it kind of goes through understanding that not all behaviors are a matter of choice. So that's another important thing, is is it's a different lens, it's a different model. And absolutely, we can bring these into schools, we can bring these into districts. In our district, after the issue with restraint and seclusion, we were able to convince them to try some different training approaches. So they took on UCARO as a crisis management approach, and then they began training the collaborative proactive solutions approach. So providing those kinds of tools to our educators are going to make them better suited to avoid crisis in the first place, because that's what it's all about, being proactive. And like you said, how many times has a parent heard, well, this just came out of nowhere? And like Alex said, things don't come out of nowhere. If you think it came out of nowhere, you're missing something, because a lot of problems are predictable. Even if the instance is not predictable, the problem is predictable. So in collaborative proactive solutions, they have a tool that they use called the ALSOP, which is the assessment of lagging skills and unsolved problems, if I'm getting that right. And it's something you do proactively with your team to understand where this child struggles. Because if you understand where they're having a hard time, you can develop a plan to address some of those things. So absolutely, training, different approaches, they're out there. There's some fantastic things people can be doing.
Well, I also want to touch on not doing those, not doing that training, not getting to the other side of this, not, stopping that restraint and seclusion. Um, there is an excerpt from a book, Punished by Reward. It says, control breeds the need for more control, which is used to justify the use of more control. I know that you probably are familiar with that, but as adults, when we forcibly put our hands on children, are we teaching them to express their emotion with aggression or retaliate with violence? And are we maybe erasing, the lines of consent? When we lay our bodies on top of a child, with that prone restraint. So, are we creating that vicious cycle, that behavior that we wanted to stop in the first place?
Yeah, and I think listening to your question, you know the answer to that, which is absolutely we are. I mean, think about even our efforts, because certainly one of the things we want to do in education is we want to educate people in their least restrictive environment. We want to stand by principles of inclusion. But what does it say when the child with the child with a disability is being physically restrained in a classroom full of others? What does it say to the child? I mean, when we model something, I mean, again, if I were to restrain another adult, what would happen to me? I would end up in jail. What are we modeling when we're modeling these control-based approaches? We're modeling very bad things, not only to the children that are being restrained, but also to those that are watching. So you're modeling, you're modeling what turns into something that can be quite violent. So this is again why these kinds of things should be exceedingly rare. I mean, if it was truly a life or death situation and there was a child getting ready to jump in front of a car, would I want you to wrap your arms around them and restrain them? Absolutely. If a child had a pair of scissors with the intent to stab someone in the chest, would I want you to restrain them and save a life? Absolutely. But more often than not, these things are not happening for those reasons. And it's not limited to schools. I mean, there's a huge industry around kind of behavior, where parents will send children off to out of state schools that use a lot of these tactics, and there's ranches and other things where this kind of thing happens. And of course it also happens in medical settings as well. But yeah, to your point, and I'm a big fan of Alfie Kohn, the Punished by Reward, which gets to this whole point that we sometimes are training children like they're circus animals. It's do this and you get a Skittle. Really what we need to be doing is we need to be developing sincere relationships with people, and we need to be helping them to develop the skills that they need to be successful. I think a lot has changed. A lot has changed since my childhood, but there's still a lot of things that are happening. Corporal punishment. I think we might have talked about that before, but corporal punishment still happens in 19 states. There are 19 states where it's still legal for a teacher to spank a child in a classroom. And if you look at the definition of corporal punishment, it is inflicting pain to give you control. I mean, it's what it's all about. I absolutely believe those are the wrong things to be modeling to children. I absolutely believe when you're doing it disproportionately to a certain group of people, it's discriminatory. So there's a lot of problems there to unpack.
You've definitely given us a road to go down for how to change things. What happens if we don't? I want to tell you a little bit about what's going on here in Arkansas. We have voluntary state guidelines. Actually, when I was calling the Department of Education, they couldn't give me any type of data on seclusion and restraint that's used in Arkansas public school districts or anywhere, because the schools keep their own data. So doing my research, I actually came across a special education attorney who did a great blog post, and she pointed out that restraint and seclusion is also usually documented, and it's coded when documented. So it won't say restraint and seclusion. It'll say things like handled with care or de-escalated, CPI hold, passed through a quiet room, referred to a safe space, or went into a blue room. So she said things like this. So usually parents don't actually know what's going on. So I actually took it upon myself to reach out to some of our pledge champions who are educators, and they confirmed that for me, that that's happening, not just when that blog post was written a couple of years ago, but that's still happening here in our school districts. So they also said that restraint and seclusion is presented to parents in IEP meetings as support. And they want it written into actual IEPs as a way to calm down, for a child to be able to calm down. They actually present it and say that when a child is restrained, they feel better because they don't feel like they're so out of control. So I want you to correct me if I'm wrong, but I want you to know that I took this week to research this Food for Thought Friday for our participants and the people that are going to be able to listen after work. We don't actually have any evidence backing up that theory. Am I correct? That when someone restrains you, you don't necessarily feel better when someone restrains you against your will. Do you know of any evidence of that?
No, I don't know of any evidence. And in fact, the evidence is all contrary to that.
Okay.
As I'm listening to that, my amygdala is starting to light up a little bit.
But we do have the evidence that is backing up the theory that we do have. Well, okay, so we have evidence that there is adverse effects for restraint and seclusion, and the research shows that there's lasting traumatizing impacts.
That's right.
We also have testimonies of self-advocates expressing their traumatizing experience within seclusion and restraint, and we also unfortunately have documented death certificates when things have gone horribly wrong.
Right. Yeah. What you call something does not justify it. So, we've seen this plenty of time with seclusion rooms. They're called the quiet room, the reflection room, the blue room, the calm down room, whatever it may be. Naming a solitary confinement cell the calm down room doesn't make it less traumatic. Some of these rooms are padded. Some of them are just closets. I mean, they come in different shapes and sizes. It shouldn't be a discussion about how big the room needs to be. It should be a discussion with seclusion about fully getting rid of it. Seclusion, there was a Senate report in 2014, and it basically kind of said there's no evidence that there's any therapeutic or educational value to these practices. Period. Full stop. I mean, there isn't. People will say, well, it's a therapeutic hold. No, it's not a therapeutic hold. A hug may be therapeutic, but restraint and seclusion are not. So putting it under the guise of we're doing something good. And one of the things I want to hit on something you said, which is very often parents aren't aware, and this happens to kids. And I remember reading a story about a teacher in New England, I think it was. And she was talking about restraint and seclusion, basically said that she had been told by her administration, unless it leaves a scratch or bruise, we don't report it. So think about this for a second. There are kids that are restrained and secluded that aren't eager to come home and tell you that they were restrained and secluded because the kid, they were being punished. So they may not want to come home and tell you, guess what? I got thrown in the reflection room because they're in trouble. But there's other kids that think, well, mom and dad know everything that happened to me at school. Okay. And kids really believe that. They think that if it happened, it. So they're not going to bring it up because they think you know it. There's other kids that may be either limited in their verbal ability and not be able to tell you exactly what happened. One of the things that I encourage people to do is talk to their kids if they have any suspicion and make sure these kind of things aren't happening. It can be just kind of a casual conversation. It doesn't have to be, I mean, it can be something that's not going to be traumatizing to the kid. You can couch it in such a way to, hey, has anything like this ever happened in your school? I heard something about this. But find out. But also look at the signs. So as a parent, if going to school, we've all seen some school avoidance occasionally, but if school avoidance begins to spike, your child becomes very reluctant to go to school or to see a teacher or to see a particular person. If you notice signs at home, like behavior suddenly escalating, summer vacation's great, and suddenly back to school and your kid's stress level goes through the roof, these are things to be concerned about. Now, it doesn't mean that, correlation is not causation. So it doesn't mean that that's what's going on, but I just encourage you to be really vigilant as a parent if you're noticing differences at home. So, back to your point, yeah, people often don't know. Saying that it's therapeutic, and what's interesting, you mentioned some of the providers, and I'll bring up the case in our local area. They were using CPI for their training, and I was led to believe that CPI provided training in the use of restraint and seclusion. I later was in touch with CPI and found out, in fact, they actually don't teach the use of seclusion. They don't advocate for or teach the use of seclusion. So my question then was, who's teaching you how to use these things? Because the state law says you're required to have training. So even the things that you hear may not always be factual, but absolutely, these things are not therapeutic. They're not educational. They lead to trauma. Again, children are not little adults, but if it seems wrong to you, if it seems wrong, if it was happening to you, um, it's wrong.
So I want to talk to you about the people that may be ready to take action. Of course, like I said before, we are only giving the information. We are only,
Right.
leading them. We're only making a path for them, for the people that actually want to take action. What does meaningful policy look like? Like I said, our Department of Education doesn't have this.
Right.
So, I mean, is that a big deal?
Well, currently it's a huge deal because right now there's no federal legislation. So if you don't have a state level law related to restraint seclusion, I think that's a huge problem, and probably has led to a lot of usage that's going unreported or underreported. Now there are federal reporting requirements under the Office of Civil Rights, so schools are supposed to be reporting the use of restraint seclusion every 2 years to the Office of Civil Rights, but that data has come under scrutiny from the Government Accountability Office as being very inaccurate. Lots of problems, lots of school districts not reporting. So starting out with what might somebody do? I mean, the first thing I always tell people is, well, starting off with my own story, my intro is usually just, I'm just a dad. I wasn't somebody that this was my intended road to go down. I'm just a father who had something happen to my son. And to be honest with you, I've had some good results in affecting some change. There's a lot of work to be done, but the idea here is that you can make a difference, that anyone can make a difference if they decide that that's what they want to do. What I typically recommend is that people do their homework, they do their research, they try to find out the data and the information. They try to find others that might be interested in the issue as well, because it's always better to do things with allies. And allies can be other parents, but they can be organizations as well. So reaching out to, when I was trying to change policy in our county, I reached out to Disability Rights Maryland, the ARC, Parents Place of Maryland, different organizations in our state that advocate for disability rights. I asked them to write letters to our county board of education, and they did. So working with others can be really helpful. So it's about doing your homework, working with others, kind of coming up with a plan. And, ultimately, again, this is an issue that, in my opinion, needs change on a local level, a state level, and a federal level. You're going to get the potential of the quickest action happening on your local level. There's less overhead to changing a local policy than there is a changing state or federal legislation. So if you are concerned about this happening at your school level, of course, conversations can even start within the school level, or they may go up to the district level. But you have the ability to change just things within your district. You can also meet with your state legislators at the state level, not the federal level, who can sometimes support that as well. I looked at this as kind of a campaign, and what did I need to do to try to influence people to change? And sometimes getting a hold of, for instance, a state senator who would then call the superintendent for our school district and say, hey, what's going on here? So, making connections and finding people that are going to be supportive of your work can be really helpful. Of course, there is federal legislation being reintroduced. It's being reintroduced kind of late in this term, and I expect will be reintroduced as we get into the next term. But certainly I would encourage people to support that legislation by contacting their elected representatives. Again, I mean, based on if they support this idea, which I hope you do. But I mean, I understand and have talked to people who have had different opinions. I will tell you that the opinions that I'm bringing forward to you have been well researched and focused on a lot of the science behind this. It's not just that I had the opinion that these things were wrong, but kind of looking at the science and whatnot behind it. So the big first step is just deciding you want to try to influence change, and then figuring out which road to start on first.
Wonderful. So I'm going to ask you a couple of questions, okay? Just so
Sure.
I can be clear and I can make sure that all of our parents, our peer advocates, and our self-advocates have a clear understanding of what we've gone over. For this policy, how important is accountability within our school districts?
Oh, it's critical. It's critical. The problem with accountability is no matter how much accountability you ask for it, it never seems to be quite enough. And I'll give you examples. The Office of Civil Rights has been collecting data on the restraint and seclusion since 2009. So they collect that data. When they get it, they spend a long time before it becomes available. So the transparency is not very good. We just got the 2017-2018 data about, a month ago. Here we are in 2020. Prior to that, it was the 2014-15 data. So we had 6-year-old data that we were looking at. So that's a problem. And in fact, we're hoping to encourage federal lawmakers to put some pressure on that at the federal level. But data has to be timely, it has to be relevant, and it has to be accurate. So data is important, but data alone is not enough. In Maryland in 2017, we started collecting data. And we gave some requirements of what that would look like. We also asked that the data report include recommendations. As long as you're not specific, you will probably not get what you want. So one of the things that we found both with OCR and both in Maryland and other places is that recording data doesn't mean much in and of itself. So right now, we are actually beginning to try to push for additional legislation on that data reporting to say, not only do we want you to report it, we want you to analyze it, and then we want you to look where there are people that are very high or very low in the use of these interventions. If they're very high, we want you to work with the districts to come up with a plan to lower these numbers. If they're zeros, we want you to verify that's right, because we know that zeros are sometimes wrong. So, we're trying in Maryland now to go back and get something more specific than what we asked for before. OCR is the same way. OCR is not proactive with their data. They collect it, they eventually report it. And that report, like I said, just came out, and you'll see the cover. It's got a bunch of smiling kids on top of the report about restraint and seclusion, which is a little disturbing. But in that report, they provide data, but they're not proactively doing things with the data. So, for instance, you can file an Office of Civil Rights complaint if you suspect a civil rights violation, but they're not looking at the data and then saying, okay, well, who do we need to target here? What do we need to do? How do we need to make improvements? And same happens at the state level. So, we need accountability, but we also need some kind of proactive measure. So collecting data is a great step. I'd be happy to share with you behind the scenes as well the things that we've done in Maryland on collecting data. And after collecting data for 2 years, the holes we found that said, oh, gee, we need more. Because again, the data should be helpful. And I'll give you an example. Our data for non-publics, the use of restraint and seclusion happens most often in a lot of the private placements. So a lot of the non-public, but funded through the school district. So school district sends a child off that they're not able to support to another location. And we see half of the restraints and seclusions in the state happening at those specialized facilities. The data for those is all combined together, so it doesn't list which schools are doing it the most. To me, that's not enough. We need to know which schools are actually doing it the most, and we need to have corrective plans in place as well. So data collection is really important. It's got to be timely, it's got to be accurate, it's got to be actionable, and we need to make sure that they're following up with certain actions. So just saying, give us a report, that's what you'll get. You'll get a report. You need to go a step further, and that's what we learned in Maryland.
And then I want to ask you, so you've covered a lot of my questions right there. So I think that you did a great job answering that. Thank you so much. So I'm glad to see we're on the same page here. I think that it's also, and correct me if I'm wrong, a main goal to kind of bring it all full circle. So we need to know what we want to get out of this also, within our own alliance, within our own group here.
Mhm.
Do we want to end restraint seclusion? Do we all want to offer more support to our teachers? Like what are we trying to make happen here in Arkansas if we do want to start the steps to approach this topic?
Yeah. So, in my opinion, and I'm not I'm not a resident of Arkansas, obviously, but in my opinion, if I was providing guidance on what to ask for in a state law right now, I would seek a prohibition on the use of seclusion.
Okay.
There is no evidence support the use of seclusion. We find that it in fact leads to an increase in aggression and increase in behaviors. So seclusion should go away completely. That's also true of the federal legislation. And I would use that. If I was in Arkansas, I would say, guess what? Here's a copy of the Keeping All Students Safe Act, and it says it's going to get rid of seclusion. Maybe we should do that before the federal government tells us we have to. Maybe we should come up with a plan to get rid of it now before we're told we must get rid of it. So I would begin with that. I would begin with getting rid of seclusion completely. I would also want to ban in its entirety any form of restraint, any form of dangerous restraint like prone restraint, a face down restraint, any kind of restraint that impacts the ability of a child to breathe. I would go for full prohibition on that as well. I think it's really important to make sure the bar is high. Um, my colleagues and I at the Alliance have had lots of discussions about this, and one of our concerns is, I think that we would all agree that the use of restraint as a truly emergency intervention in a case that could lead to death, we'd want that to happen to our child to save their life. The problem is that as long as there's a doorway open, people seem to use and abuse some of these interventions. So it's hard to find the balance. But I'd say, definitely we should be following the imminent serious physical harm standard. So that should be part of it as well. But having that alone is not proved to be enough in a state like Maryland, where we still know it happens probably far more often than not for situations that don't. But the third thing is, how do you bring in that training? I think that's a huge piece of it. And of course, in these difficult times and with COVID in the background, certainly pushing legislation with a high fiscal note is going to be a challenge. So how do we bring that training into this piece as well? Because it's critical. And, we've even looked at kind of the secondary education area as well. Like, how do we make sure that the teachers are getting enough training that are coming into programs? So I think that training has to be part of it. And to me, it's trauma informed, it's neuroscience based, all of those things. And the question is, how prescriptive does your legislation need to be? If it's not prescriptive enough, it needs to at least provide guidance, or the state needs to provide guidance. Our Department of Education, for the last 2 reporting cycles, has said that they were going to come up with a listing of trauma-informed approaches, not trauma-informed, the evidence-based approaches that could be used. And I've yet to see that database, and when I asked them to make it available, my request was not answered. So the State Department of Education, or whoever it is in your state, needs to be active in trying to promote these alternatives. But the legislation, I think it's a full ban on seclusion, dangerous forms of restraint, imminent serious physical harm. And again, I would recommend for you, the new language of CASA is out. It's linked on our website. We've got an article about that, so you can link to the language. And I would use that to think about how to model a state level law right now. I might have more specific suggestions after reviewing the language again, but I think that's a really good starting place.
Wonderful, wonderful. I do have a question for you.
Okay.
And this might be a hard question, but I know it's a need, because I know that we are going to come across these people or anyone that wants to take action on this. They're out there. We know they're out there. Before I start this, I want you to know that I found this comment on a discussion board when I was going across, the teacher discussion boards here in Arkansas, and I found a lot of this. Before I start, I want everyone to know that this is not the language that I use, but I think it's important to analyze this fully and read it right off the page. So, Guy, I want you to listen to this, and I want you to educate us on how we should handle this, if that's okay, or how you have handled this in the past, because I know you've come across it. So this is the actual blog post from the discussion board. It says the main reason students with disabilities represent 67% of students who are restrained or secluded is because they are 67% of these students who need to be restrained or secluded in order to protect other students and or staff members. Sadly, this situation has been caused by extreme interpretations of the same law that seeks to protect their rights in most school settings. An IEP has become a license for special needs students to disrespect, offend, threaten, and physically hurt their peers and staff members with complete immunity. Many special ed students quickly learn that school rules don't apply to them, so they act in more and more disrespectful, defiant, and violent ways until schools are left with nothing but the need to restrain and seclude them. Advocates and professional enablers have created this problem, so maybe it's now up to them to fix it in a way that's mindful of the rights of the rest of the schools. Arkansas Teacher Discuss Board. So
Yeah.
I know that you have come across people that feel like this, that
Right.
children should be restrained and secluded because of their personal actions. So I know that you've made the comment before about violence assumes intent. So I want to know how you handled this, since you do it more often than the rest of us do.
Mm-hmm. I mean, this is not the first time I've seen or heard comments like that. And there's a lot wrong with that whole train of thought. And I think it's based on a lot of assumptions that I find, frankly, to be offensive. I mean, it's making this idea that, I mean, again, I don't even think it's subtle about it, that, we're advocating for kids because we want them to be able to get away with doing anything they want. And they're doing it through intent, and they're trying to be harmful, and they're making, so it's control. It's all about control. It's all about compliance. And again, we're called enablers for trying to protect the needs. To me, this shows a real lack of, well, I think a lack of, understanding, a lack of compassion, a lack of, realizing, so I said this earlier, but if these things worked, if these were successful interventions, we would be doing them less and less and less. They are not. They are aggravating the situation. They're making people less safe. There's a lot of science out there. Now, some people, again, people will disagree, and even probably people that are part of your community may disagree on certain things. A lot of people want to look at things as a matter of, compliance and control. So it's, well, yeah, what that boy needs is a good whooping. I mean, that's how we're going to set this straight. People that don't really have a whole lot of understanding or knowledge about disability, and I think we're always going to be pushing back. But I mean, the science is on our side. The neuroscience is on our side. We've got far better ways of working with children. And again, it's often the the unions and some of the teachers have been teaching for a very long time. There was a point in our history where kids with disabilities weren't welcome in educational environments. They weren't welcome in schools. And there are people that will look at it as, well, your child's a disruption of mine and doesn't belong there. Okay, your child doesn't have a right to be with my child. These are things that we set out to work through with IDEA, and of course, there's been issues with being appropriately funded and all of that as well. But I mean, this is I mean, it's a lot of rubbish. I mean, if you think that that's the right answer, but there are people in our world that think that it's about discipline, who have little understanding or empathy towards people that have disabilities. I mean, again, if you're neurodiverse, you've got a brain that's wired a little differently and responds to situations a little differently. And I think that it's a very dated ideology. So I think it's a matter of trying to compel with kind of science and evidence. It's not just about disciplining them harder. If it did, then your approach would have worked, wouldn't it? We've got to do better. I mean, the truth is, so let me phrase it to you this way. So, having and again, I will have a conversation with anyone who's interested in having a conversation, whether they agree with me or not, because I think conversations can be helpful. And, I've had conversations with people that didn't necessarily agree with me on certain things. Now, I will tell you again, this is just not a random opinion that I had. I mean, this was the result of a lot of research that backs this. But here it is. If we want to simplify this, we know without a shadow of a doubt that when we use restraint and or seclusion, we are increasing the chance of injury to a student, to the teachers, and the staff. Anytime we use these things. So if we can just agree that these things can result in injury, regardless of why they think they're happening, we can agree that they can result in injury. My question for that individual is, if we could do better, if we could reduce the chance of injury to the student, the teacher, and the staff, would you want to? Would you want to do something that could reduce that likelihood? And I don't know how you can say no, even if you disagree and you don't understand where behavior is coming from in many cases, and you think it's all by will. This 7-year-old who is, say hypothetically, we've got an autistic 7-year-old who has great difficulties in certain areas. You want to believe that they're actually manipulating you and doing things to control their environment, and outsmarting you. That's the way you want to look at this. I mean, really? I mean, there's just so much that goes beyond that. So again, the question is, if you could do better, would you want to? And I don't know how anybody can say no to that. If we can do better and reduce the chance of injury to everybody, shouldn't we do that? And that would be ultimately my response to that person. There are some people that are very very dedicated to their opinion without a lot of facts. And things have changed. I mean, we're growing up in a different time. From my childhood to where I am now, things have changed. They will continue to change. I think a lot of it's progress, but there's a lot of progress left to be made. And there's a lot of opinions out there. One of the things I'd say to you is, in threads like what you read, I'm often very disappointed if we share a story about a child being restrained or secluded, a child with disabilities, having a difficult time. You'd be amazed at some of the negative comments that people have. It still seems okay in 2020 in some circles to be very discriminatory against people with disabilities. And I find that really, really concerning. But, it's a sign that we've got a lot more work to do. And I don't think we're done until we make more progress.
I totally agree. I want to thank you so much for that specific information, especially because no matter how far individuals are going to go on this journey, I know that they're going to come across that attitude.
Oh,
Um,
absolutely, absolutely. And again, having allies, having other people, that's why, I mean, our community has grown quite a bit. We've only been around for a little under 2 years, and we've got about 10,000 people now on social media, and a very supportive community. People that have been through this, and we're there too for you and your community. In any way that we can help. Advocacy is not always easy. Nor is doing the right thing often easy. But we've got to do it. And whether or not these things are happening to your child right now, if you have a child that may fall into that profile, it could. It doesn't mean that it's happening now, but it could. And a lot of these schools where they use these things heavily, it's happening to kids that it shouldn't be happening to.
Right, right. Thank you so much. I appreciate that so much. And I know that everyone that was here with us appreciates it, and all the people that are going to be able to watch it later. We thank you so much. We have got your website, your Facebook page, all in the comment section already. We've got a survey. That way we can get anyone that wants to send you an email. We'll get that email address and to you, that type of thing. So anything else that you want to give our listeners today or in the future whenever they get to watch it?
Yeah, I mean, I thank you for the opportunity. I'm always happy to talk about this topic. It's very near and dear to my heart. I feel very, very passionately about it because of our family's experience. And, if there's anything that I can do to help in the efforts that are happening there, we want to do that. Any individuals that have any questions, they're always welcome to contact me. We're always looking for additional help as well. So, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. And, again, the more we can do in more places. I mean, the change that I was able to advocate for in our local school district, it's a small change, but that small change may mean that there's another child out there that's not going to be traumatized like my son was. There's other children that may not be injured or even die because of these things. They're really important changes. So wherever you're able to influence change, it's going to be a positive thing. So let me know if there's anything I can do to help in that journey for anyone that might be watching this, either now or after the fact.
God, thank you so much for being here with us today on Food for Thought Friday. I appreciate you so much. I know all of Community of Champions appreciates you. It is our job to give out the resources everyone needs to be a strong advocate, and you helped us do that today. Thank you so, so much.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And I wish you and everyone else all the best of luck, not only staying healthy during these challenging days, but also with your advocacy efforts. It's so important to have people like your community out there doing things to make a difference.
Thank you so much. And everyone else, we will see you next time on Food for Thought Friday. We appreciate you being here, and anything you need, you just let us know. Have a great day.